Thanks for joining everyone that's here today. My name is Sean Budden. I'm the ergonomist at the Workers' Compensation Board, and I will be chatting today about how we make ergonomics programs stick, and really focusing on the sustainability side of things. And the content today will be recorded, so it'll be available on our platforms, YouTube, and maybe through our website. And the content today really should be applicable to most workplaces, regardless of the type of work you do or the industry that you're in. And I'm going to tell the story about the tips and the tricks through kind of the story of our injury prevention team here at WCB. And so just to I guess one thing, if you do have any comments, throw them in the chat and we will get to them at the end of the conversation today. So just feel free to throw any questions in the chat and Paul will help me out with that at the end. So our injury prevention team here at Workers' Compensation Board in Nova Scotia, so there's the ergonomists, myself, and the workplace consultants. We work kind of hand in hand and really focus on both injury prevention as well as return to work. And our mandate is really around the sustainability. And so when we think about ergonomic programs, I'm sure anyone that's been involved in one, it's sometimes a challenge to keep them going, whether somebody leaves the organization or moves to a different department, maybe the champion of that program. So our focus is really around sustainability and how do we make that happen. For our injury prevention team, so for myself and workplace consultants, one of the ways we try and make ergonomic programs sustainable is to really anchor them to health and safety systems and the processes that organizations are already doing well. That's why kind of I work hand in hand with those workplace consultants, who again are the kind of the generalists of safety, and I have this really kind of narrow focus on musculoskeletal injury prevention and ergonomics. I will say MSI throughout the presentation, and just as I guess as a baseline understanding. So musculoskeletal injuries are really any injury or damage or disorder to the muscles, the tendons, the ligaments, the joints, the nerves, the blood vessels, really kind of any of that soft tissue that allows our body to move. Gets kind of classified under the sprain, strain, or the MSI category. You may have heard of other terms used for it. So musculoskeletal disorder is common, MSD, as well as repetitive strain injury, or overuse injury. Really, any of those terms are talking about the same types of injuries. So I'll refer to them today as MSIs. And so me and the workplace consultants, we typically work with organizations and kind of get our main contacts, usually in the safety departments. Maybe there's an ergo champion. Maybe it's the operations side of the organization, but there's usually kind of a few contacts that we work with, and really kind of, I guess, take one step back. We work in kind of a coaching role and a support role. So we're coaching and supporting the safety teams, the ergo teams, with operations in there as well to help build internal processes and systems around safety, around ergonomics, to really prevent the injuries from happening in the first place. And because we work with a lot of different organizations in different industries of different sizes, what this kind of relationship looks like here varies depending on the organization we're working with. Sometimes there's leadership involved in this team that we're working with. Sometimes there's frontline workers, but mainly this team we work with to really kind of push information up to the leadership and out to the workforce as well. So this is kind of the basics, an outline of what the work and the relationships look like. Seems a little bit easy, perhaps from this diagram, and simple, but obviously there's some barriers that we find, especially in MSI prevention, and implementing and sustaining ergonomics programs. So what are some of those barriers that we've found? So a couple here that we've kind of found over the years in Nova Scotia. So limited or no focus on ergonomics, unsustainable ergonomic programs. So maybe they've had a program in the past, that is a little less successful now, or maybe it's folded completely. Lack of knowledge and understanding around MSIs, how they happen, as well as kind of ergonomics as a way to prevent these injuries from happening. Could be right personnel in place, whether it's in the team that we're working with, or maybe the right expertise or knowledge just isn't in the workplace, as well as limited compliant language in Nova Scotia here. So it's there's not as kind of clear, concise language around ergonomics and MSI prevention here in Nova Scotia, and organizations kind of rely on compliance language for some of their prevention programs. We might fall a little bit short in the ergonomic side of things. So our team kind of comes up against these barriers. Today, we're going to be focusing on the top two. So limited or no focus on ergonomics or unsustainable ergonomic programs, and kind of our approach to tackling these. So our approach is one, treating ergonomic hazards like any other hazard. So trying to get our organizations that we work with to think about ergonomic hazards just like a chemical hazard, biological hazard, physical hazard, trying to keep them in the same line and thought process as any of them. And then the other side of it is integrating ergonomic principles, assessment tools, and strategies into a health and safety management system. So what does that actually look like? How do we take, I guess, what are ergonomic principles, assessment tools? What do they look like? And what are some ways that we can kind of anchor them to some of those health and safety systems that the organizations are already doing really well? First up is kind of what is a safety system? You can go online and get a variety of different kind of elements of a safety program. This is from the Nova Scotia OSH Act. I simplified it and kind of paraphrased here, so it's not word for word. But these are kind of the general requirements of a safety program. So training and supervision, written work procedures, safety committee, hazard ID system, including hazard ID inspections, hazard reporting, controlling, incident investigations, maintaining safety data and records, as well as monitoring the program. And so these are kind of, if we're thinking of how do we integrate and anchor ergonomic elements to a safety system, these are kind of our options. These are our ways and kind of processes in an organization that we can look for. And we're really looking at an organization and saying like, hey, which of these do you do well? Which of them is kind of a well-oiled machine and running really well? And can we take elements of an ergonomics program and anchor it to it if you're already doing well, kind of going on the how we build habits. So common themes of an ergonomics program is what are we actually anchoring to these different elements of a safety program. So again, ergonomics programs, you can kind of Google it and you'll find a little variety in what they contain. These are kind of some 5 main themes that I've found over the years and I like. So one, facilitate and encourage workers' participation. I think this is a really big one, kind of a principle in ergonomics is, and I think it's mainly different than a safety program, because if you think about the injuries that we're preventing, MSIs, they're kind of invisible in a sense. And to understand the demands on the workers and to understand kind of the discomfort, which is a little bit of a precursor for an MSI, we really have to go out and talk to the workforce, talk to them and understand kind of where the levels of demands are, where they're finding difficulty in the work that they're doing. So on that kind of hazard identification side of things, it's important. And then if you think about the very other end of the kind of safety spectrum, we have controlling that hazard. And so with controls that are kind of in the ergonomics world, you have a lot of like equipment, you have like workstation redesign, you have kind of behavioral practice, so changing the way people do work. And so a lot of those rely on the worker to make a change to the way that they're working, whether it's using a new piece of equipment, changing their behavior, if it's more of an administrative control. So we really rely on them to do things differently for that control of the hazard. And so that kind of shows the importance of that encouraging worker participation, and why it's such a big theme and principle in ergonomics. Two is the hazard ID and risk assessment, hazard control, education, and training as well. And so that's kind of, those are the themes that we're looking at, and those are like the parts of an ergonomics program. And really all we're doing is trying to find different ways that we can anchor those themes in an ergonomics program to different parts of the safety program, and where do they fit. Sometimes it's kind of obvious. If you're controlling a chemical hazard, you can kind of use that same process to control a ergonomic hazard as well, and same with kind of monitor and evaluating. I'm going to start with maintaining safety data and records. I think a big part of safety and kind of building your business case is to really understand and have the data there to tell a bit of a story. And I do believe that good data allows us to make good decisions. And so this is kind of one of the areas that we work on with the organizations that we work with, is to take a look at the data and see if it's clean and accurate. And so I think one of the biggest things that we do is kind of, we start at a really high level and kind of work our way down to kind of a more granular level that you can actually like go out and make an action with. And so if we think really high level, these are some numbers, some time loss claims in all of Nova Scotia at WCB for 2023 and 2024. And so we can see in sprains and strains, so those MSIs are the most frequent or the most common injury type for time loss claims over the last 2 years at 63.7 and 60.8%. So they're the most common reason that people are losing time from work. And that frequency is a big piece of the puzzle as to why we should continue to maintain our focus on preventing these types of injuries. And so if we're thinking more at like an organizational level, these are some kind of ways that you can filter and sort your data to look at it to say, hey, where do we need to be focusing our efforts and our resources? Is it the same as kind of the average across Nova Scotia? Are sprains and strains and MSIs the leading injury type, or is it another injury type that you need to be putting your efforts and resources to? If it is MSIs, great. We'll kind of go through some ways that you can kind of approach that here, but this is something, at least at a very high level, we like to use to really understand where the injuries, at least like what type of injuries are the most common. Another piece of kind of building your business case for safety and ergonomics is, this is the frequency side of things, but there's also the cost of an injury, and that's a big piece, which is difficult in safety. It's hard to kind of get some numbers around it to build a case. So we'll try and do a little bit of an example here of different ways we can do that. And so, our example, so manufacturing company in Nova Scotia, they're doing their annual safety review. Let's say they have 10 time loss claims. This was mainly to do some simple math for myself. And they're an average company in Nova Scotia. So in 2024, the average MSIs were at 60.8%. So 6 out of 10 of their time loss claims were MSIs. And so if we're trying to look at the cost of these injuries, there's really kind of two main things that we're going to be looking at. So direct cost and indirect cost. For today's kind of math, direct cost is a combination of the medical expenses as well as the earnings replacement benefits. And so again, these are Nova Scotia averages. So I added up all the medical expenses and all the earnings replacement benefits for MSIs in 2024, and then divided them by the amount of sprains and strains we saw, which was just under 3,200 for 2024. So direct cost on average was $10,045. And so that's again, the direct cost, so medical and earnings replacements. The other piece to this puzzle is the indirect cost, which is a little bit harder to figure out. There are ways to kind of calculate that internally. And so indirect costs, if you're unfamiliar with it, are like the time a manager has to spend when there's an injury to fill out the incident report form, or the productivity delay or fall when an injured employee has to leave their workstation or leave the production line, or any time that someone has to go out and spend to do a incident investigation, any downtime for a line, for kind of any redesign of the equipment or anything like that. So there's a couple like variables that go into the indirect costs. And it's, unless you're kind of internal to an organization, it's a little bit difficult to calculate them. In terms of like assuming what the costs are at a larger kind of higher level. So the best kind of assumptions I've seen came out of OSHA, and the CRE MSD group in Ontario follows these as well. That's the Center for Research Expertise for Preventing Musculoskeletal Disorders. And so they have this kind of assumption of what indirect costs are. And so I won't get too in depth into it. If you want to go take a look at it, go for it. The main thing is that less expensive claims have a proportionally higher indirect cost. And so that's really because there's some fixed costs there. So like regardless if it's a $3,000 claim or a $10,000 claim, some of those costs are going to be fixed. The time it takes a manager to fill out an injury report is probably going to be roughly the same. The time that maybe a line might be down because someone had to leave work in an afternoon might be similar. And so there's some kind of fixed costs there that don't change regardless of how severe the injury is. And so that's kind of why the different factors come into play here. So if we believe these assumptions and go with these assumptions, the indirect costs for a average MSI, which is over $10,000, which would be 1.1, add them together, and you get kind of the overall cost of a average MSI here in Nova Scotia. Going back to our example here, the manufacturing company, let's say they're a very average company here in Nova Scotia, so that's the cost of their claims. And then they have 6 out of 10, so we just multiply that by 6, and we have our total costs for the 6 out of 10 claims for MSIs for their year. And so again, this is just one way that we can start to try and build our understanding of the overall risk and overall costs of these claims. This is the financial side of things. Obviously, there's the human aspect of it as well. I included the financial side of it here because I do think that we do the human side of it, and we take into account that pretty well, at least at like the manager supervisor level. We found that they do care about their workers, and they do kind of account for that human side pretty well. So I wanted to include the financial side. Again, it's difficult to get some numbers sometimes for safety, so we have to do what we can. Just a couple resources. So WorkSafe BC has a workplace incident cost calculator that you can put in some numbers to get your indirect costs if you're interested or feel like you need to take a little bit of a deeper dive into that. And then the MSD prevention guideline for Ontario has a calculator that you can get some numbers for the costs of your injuries as well. And they use the same kind of assumption of indirect costs there. So just a couple resources if you want to look into it a little bit more. So now that we know our financial risk and the frequency of injuries, we want to take a look at where these injuries are actually happening. So again, from our injury prevention team at WCB, we look at a pretty high level, and these are the top 5 industries in Nova Scotia for MSIs. Health and social services are up there. Construction, government services, manufacturing, and retail and trade. And so this is kind of okay, where do we go look to start solving some of the problems? If you're within your own organization and the ones that we coach, we'd be looking at roles or jobs. So maybe you would look at the top 5 jobs or roles, and let's say you're a hospitality organization, maybe you're looking at cook, shipping, receiving, housekeeping, reception, laundry. And so at least now you've gone from, okay, we have our most common injury is sprains and strains. Here's the financial risk, the human risk. Let's start to take a look at where these injuries are happening. And again, it's all about kind of trying to get it down to a workable, actionable level to go out and say, hey, where are some of these problems actually happening? So this is kind of that next level. One other thing to consider is the like how the injuries are happening, or why they're happening, kind of that a little bit closer to that root cause. Um, and so for Nova Scotia, again, it was 60%, roughly 60% was the sprains and strains. But if you think about how sprain and strains can happen, you can kind of break it down to a repetitive movement overuse or a slip, trip, and fall. And you really want to kind of break that down, because if you think about at the end of the day, we're trying to improve our workplace, we're trying to put a control in place. And if you want to know what injuries or how many injuries can we solve with ergonomic interventions. The slip in the parking lot, where the individual slipped on ice and fell and sprained their wrist, probably isn't going to be solved with a ergonomic intervention, but the warehouse shipping and receiving individual who pulled their shoulder packing and stacking boxes on pallets, that falls into that repetitive movement and strain, overuse kind of injury. That one could be solved potentially with an ergonomic intervention. So I like to kind of take it one step further. And we coach our employers to do this as well, to try and better understand their, not just have a, okay, we have 60% of our injuries are sprain strains, but do we actually know why some of those are happening? And so maybe this is taking a look at your injury report, to make sure that there's kind of boxes to check and areas to fill this out properly. Or maybe it's upskilling the managers or the supervisors or whoever fills out that injury report to make sure that they're recording it correctly, so that at the end of the year or whenever you review your data, it's trustworthy, it's clean, and you can kind of move forward with what you're seeing. So just a couple of ways to take a look at your data. And again, it's to build your kind of rationale and business case in terms of why we need to be caring about this. And maybe if you do have to go to a decision maker in your organization, it's good to be able to speak a little bit more of their language, and to have some information to back up requests or some initiatives that you want to push forward. So going back to the kind of integrating ergonomics into health and safety. So we talked about the numbers. We're going to touch on the hazard ID and risk assessment next here. Hazard ID and risk assessment looks a little bit different in ergonomics, mainly because the field has come up with their kind of own specific assessment tools over the years that really take into account all the variables that come into play when we're thinking about how an MSI occurs. So if we think about there's lots of kind of different types of ergonomic assessments. I like to break it down this way. I got this from Jim Potvin. He did a presentation last year, and he kind of laid it out this way, and it made sense in my brain. So hopefully it does for you as well. So there's really kind of like three types of ergonomic assessments. You have your hazard ID, which is kind of black and white, yes, no answers. You have your category based, which is a little bit more of like a sliding scale of risk, and that's kind of what you get out of it. And then you have your physics based, for your threshold limit values, that quantify the physical exposure a little bit more. And I think based on your understanding of your own organization's one level of risk. So looking at your data and how, I guess, how risky is your tasks, is your work environment for MSIs. Also like the complexity of MSIs, would really dictate kind of on what level you'd be looking at for your ergonomic assessment. The most simple ones, the hazard ID, it really kind of looks at, is the risk factor present, yes or no. It's usually checklist based, and you're looking at things like, are the hands above the shoulders? If yes, that's kind of a risk factor for a shoulder injury or shoulder MSI. Some examples of these, so the Workers' Compensation Board here in Nova Scotia, we have a workplace inspection checklist that you can take a look at, as well as the Washington State checklist as well. And there's lots of different kind of screening checklists in that category. The category based, they look at like ranges of things. So like is the amount of weight you're lifting between 5 and 15 kilograms or 15 and 30. Or they'd be looking at different posture and hand positions. Are your hands between your knees and your shoulders? Are they above your shoulders or below your knees? And then they'd be looking at your frequency and duration. So are you doing this task for 1 hour a day, 3 to 5, or 5+, those sorts of things. And some examples are the rapid upper limb assessment or the rapid entire body assessment, as well as the quick exposure checklist, which is the QEC. Then the kind of the most, I guess, complex would be the physics-based ones, and their outputs have physical units. So they'd be looking at the forces, torque or movements or moments. So like what's the torque or the moments on lifting a box at the back or twisting and those sorts of things, as well as energy expenditure. So what's the energy that is needed to complete this task for a certain duration. And then they're all compared to the TLVs in the literature. Some examples are the revised NIF lifting equation or the Liberty Mutual manual material handling equation. So that's kind of a quick breakdown of the different high-level types of ergonomic assessments. And again, I think kind of where you might be looking for an assessment really depends on the risk that your organization has for the frequency and costs associated with MSIs, as well as the complexity of MSIs. Sometimes the fixes and understanding why the injury is occurring is pretty simple, and so a simple kind of yes/no checklist might suffice. But it might get a little bit more complicated and move you up into the kind of closer to the right and closer to those physics-based ones that would require a little bit more expertise to roll out. So that's like the assessments. And if we think about how do we kind of integrate these into our hazard ID? So one example that me and one of the workplace consultants that I work with do, so we were working with an organization and they were kind of revising their hazard ID system, and they had their individual going out to different tasks and looking at the hazards. This is the kind of the document that they were using, but there's lots of different examples of hazard ID forms out there. So they had the hazard, what part of the task might hurt you. An example is stacking boxes on a pallet. They also had the risk, how could the hazard hurt you? And in their case, they were using kind of the type of injury to fill in that field. And so a lot of the challenges that we find are when people get to kind of what's the level of risk. And so if you think about any kind of like safety matrix, and the calculations usually involve the frequency, the likelihood, and the severity, it's a little bit difficult to kind of estimate what a back injury could be. And so maybe there's twisting involved, or the weight of the box is 20 pounds. And is that going to be disc herniation, or is it going to be a slight tweak and I put ice on it at the end of the night? And so we were finding people were hesitant and a little bit unsure of kind of how to calculate that total risk. And luckily there's ergonomic assessment tools that do a better job of that for us. And so the example of how we integrated it into this example for this organization was we just created a new column, and for any ergonomic hazards that came through, they had a QEC required section that they could just check the box, and then that triggered a kind of a second process to happen, where they had their safety team was trained on how to use the QEC, and they would go out and determine if the QEC was needed to complete the assessment and better understand the hazard. And in terms of like what actually went into making this happen, so there's really two things that were a bit of a challenge. So we did a process document, again, just kind of standard process document about how people were trained in the QEC, who was going to use it, what happened when this box got checked, all the kind of the ins and the outs, and got that approved. So it was kind of documented, and again, making ergonomics a little bit stickier, getting it documented and kind of stamped for the processes and the documents. The other thing was the risk rating system. And I think we find when we're trying to integrate ergonomics into health and safety, we find this issue quite a bit. The language is just different enough to make it frustrating. for sure. And so the QEC has its own kind of scoring system, and it's a standardized document, so we couldn't change the scoring system on that. And so we had to go back to the kind of the risk matrix system for the organization, and the end result was that they used kind of the same scoring language that the QEC. So it was low, moderate, high, or very high for the scoring system. And so they kind of mirrored it. The numbers didn't mirror it. I won't go too far into the numbers on this. Don't want to get too nerdy. But let's say they had like a risk of like their total risk calculated out to a 34. A 34 wasn't the same as a 34 on the QEC, but the boxes that they put those numbers into, so the low, medium, or the low, moderate, high, and very high, were equivalents in terms of level of risk. And so it took quite a bit of time. We had a couple meetings and sat down at a table and went over it, did some trial and error in terms of what certain incidents would calculate out to, and were we happy with the end result? Did we think MSIs were overscored or underscored? We wanted to try and get it to as much to apples as possible. It probably wasn't perfect, but we were happy with kind of where the level of risks were when we came out. So that was one kind of challenge that we had with it. And again, it was just kind of the completing the hazard ID and risk assessment, going through the risk ratings, and then merging it back. So when it was written back in the document, the numbers weren't used. It was the words and the language. So low, moderate, high, or very high were used. So it looked consistent and nice and clean on the assessment. So that's kind of how we did that one there. Another option is workplace inspections in terms of kind of anchoring and integration. A lot of organizations do this well. It's consistent and it's a habit, and people go out on the floor and inspect different departments. The example over here on the right is the one from Aware, Nova Scotia. I think some consideration, so make sure that you include ergonomic related criteria, at least like the ergonomic hazards or risk factors that relate and kind of result in an injury occurring. So things like force, repetition, duration, and awkward postures. And you can't really account for all of the different postures and forces in there, but if you at least get your workers or whoever is doing the inspections to think about it. So you could have a question like, do workers lift heavy objects, or are workers lifting objects over 40 pounds, or whatever your cutoff might be? You could be asking, are workers lifting and twisting? Are they reaching? Those sorts of things. So I think it's just the prompts to try and have, it could be reaching overhead or reaching below your knees, kind of any little prompt that's going to get the worker or anyone doing the inspection to watch the worker and see what they're doing, and seeing if they can kind of pick out any high forces, repetitive movements, and awkward postures that they can. Another big opportunity, I think, with the inspections is to observe any like non-use of controls. And so I find a lot of the time with controls, we put them in place, and then the worker, let's say it's a piece of equipment, it's a month later and the piece of equipment isn't doing what we thought it would. They put it in a storage closet and we never talk about it again. And so I think these workplace inspections are a really good opportunity to see if those controls are in place, if those devices are being used and maintained, and if not, it's the why aren't we using them. A lot of times when we're controlling for ergonomic hazards, the first iteration of a control or solution usually isn't the best one. Usually it's the second or third, and so we need those workers to provide feedback to us on why a control isn't working. And so I think these inspections are a great place to have kind of a coworker go out and say, hey, why aren't you using that dolly? Or I thought we were supposed to be using those carts, and oh no, the wheels are gummed up, or the wheels aren't working, or the back ones don't rotate, and I need the front ones to be locked and the back ones to rotate, or whatever the reason might be. But it's a way to start having that conversation and catch controls that aren't being used before we have an injury, and then we're going out and investigating the injury, and we're like, I thought you were supposed to be using a cart for that, and they're like, the cart doesn't work, or I don't like the cart, or whatever the reason is. So I think it's a good chance to kind of catch stuff like that. Another opportunity that you could have a prompt for a more in-depth ergonomic assessment to be completed if needed. So just looking at different kind of ways to anchor some of those ergonomic practices that we talked about. Another way is hazard reporting. So discomfort surveys are pretty popular in the ergonomics world. It's a qualitative kind of survey to get workers' perception on levels of discomfort, as well as, I think the thing that I like about it best is it requires the workers to attach a task to the discomfort that they're experiencing. So a worker might fill it out and say, I'm having shoulder discomfort. Let's say they're a mechanic at a car dealership, and they might be having shoulder discomfort when they're taking large truck tires on and off the vehicles. And so they'd be able to list that task against the shoulder discomfort. And so these discomfort surveys, typically we recommend them getting filled out on an annual basis, and usually one-on-one is preferable. And you get kind of a whole, like an entire group of workers to fill them up. So if you're doing mechanics, you would get all of your mechanics to fill them out. So it becomes a little bit more of a trend instead of just one loud voice with the perception of complaining or anything like that. You might get 7 out of 10 of our mechanics are talking about shoulder pain related to taking large truck tires on and off the vehicle. So you can start to build a little bit of trend around discomfort. And I also really like it as it's a communication channel between managers and workers. We talked about kind of encouraging worker participation in both the hazard ID and the control side of things. This is a great way to involve workers in the identification of ergonomic hazards. And some of the organizations that we work with have kind of over the years built an Excel sheet to kind of put the discomfort surveys enter it into the Excel, and there's some charts and tables that refresh to pump out the information in a little bit more of a digestible manner, instead of just having 10 paper surveys and trying to flick through and see any trends or anything. And so you can kind of filter by tasks or levels of discomfort and those sorts of things to quickly get to the tasks that are causing the most issue. And again, the whole thing is to be able to go out and say, okay, we have a task to go look at, or we have a job to go look at, and let's see if we can figure something out and make some improvements here. So I touched on this a little bit before. So facilitating and encouraging workers' participation, another kind of big piece and theme in ergonomics programs, and really just working to try and see where can we anchor this to. I think the obvious one is the safety committee or the rep with leadership commitment, and so that's pretty common. Most organizations do this fairly well and have commitment from the workers and have that kind of representation. So I think that's an easy one. Another one is training and supervision. Any kind of training for whether it's frontline worker or supervisor, you want to make sure that people know the signs and symptoms of MSIs, how to ID an MSI hazard. So we touched a little bit about the force, the repetition, awkward posture, and duration. So even if you're communicating and educating people on those 4 and how they result in MSI hazards or ergonomic hazards, reporting pain and discomfort. So when to report, as well as how to report, whether it's through discomfort surveys or through completing an injury report form. Making sure people understand and know when to do that. Again, going back to like the having good data, if people aren't reporting injuries until they're more serious and they have to go off work, it makes things a lot more complicated, both for the recovery and return to work, as well as the understanding of when an injury happens, especially for over a period of time stuff. Planning and implementing controls. I touched on the importance of workers being involved in implementing controls, mainly because they have such a role to play in using the controls, whether it's equipment or changing their behavior in terms of how the work is done or designed. I think they have a huge piece in that as well. So making sure that's part of the training as well, so that they understand how controls kind of get put in place and their value in that process, and making sure that they feel comfortable to bring up any issues with controls, so that we can improve them moving forward. A couple other areas, so on the hazard identification side of things, so hazard ID, making sure workers are familiar with that, and you can also train workers, especially in those kind of that first column on the left, the ergonomic hazard or the ergonomic assessments that are kind of the checklist, yes, no. They're great for like Josh committees and stuff like that. People pick up on them, and they're easy to use, easy to read, easy to understand. Inspections as well, so making sure that workers are rotated on any of the workplace inspections to get fresh eyes and give them a chance to talk with workers about the different ergonomic hazards that they might be experiencing when completing those. Hazard reporting, so we talked about discomfort surveys. Again, I think they're a huge opportunity to build that communication between the frontline workers and the managers that they work with. Controlling hazards, again, using small groups to pilot controls instead of just coming up with a new piece of equipment and rolling it out to everyone just to find out that it doesn't work as efficiently, or it slows the work down a little bit, or I guess worst case scenario, it creates a new hazard that now we have to go out and control for as well. So using workers, doing pilots, getting their feedback to make sure that it's working the way we thought it would and the way they need it to make sure that productivity kind of either stays where it's at or increases as well. Incident investigations as well include Josh members in the training and execution. I mean, they need to be involved in the investigations in some way anyways. So training them in how to investigate, especially MSIs, and to understand what that looks like. I think the big thing here, and again, it's not always possible to have them involved in every incident investigation, but I think the benefit here is, especially with the over period of time injuries, when some of the information or the investigation goes to the Josh meeting, and let's say it was an over period of time and the investigation came back that there was no incident, so they didn't have anything in terms of the investigation. They wrote down that the worker's shoulder got increasingly sore over the last 6 months. They don't know what happened, so they didn't actually investigate the incident. That gets to the Josh minutes and the Josh meeting, and if those individuals on that committee are educated in kind of how we would want to look at an over period of time injury and maybe some of the assessment tools that are available, we might be able to catch that injury early in that investigation early, to go back and take a little bit better look at it, instead of it just kind of getting pushed through the safety committee and saying, oh yeah, no actual point of injury. We're not sure how it happened, so we're going to focus more, maybe train the workers again, and kind of move forward. So if you have a knowledgeable Josh committee on especially something like that, like the over period of time injuries, they might be able to catch it and help out a little bit more, or at least kind of pinpoint that we need to do the investigation a little bit more thoroughly on that. Couple extra strategies. Again, just trying to keep in mind the options for kind of anchoring to the safety management system. Management to worker interactions. Some organizations have management go out on the floor and do observations on workers, have conversations with them, make sure that kind of best practices are being followed. And this one's definitely challenging, I think. So you want to make sure that your management are trained and comfortable in it, and know, I guess, what they should be looking for. I think safe work practices are super handy, or safe operating procedures, whatever term your organization uses, are super handy here, because they give that management kind of a leg to stand on, or a bit of a backbone when they're going out and trying to coach workers on kind of working patterns and behaviors. I always think back to kind of early on in my career while I was going to school. I worked as a trainer at a gym, and I was comfortable talking with my clients about best practices. But the gym I worked at wanted us to go out and talk to everyone in the gym about best practices in terms of body mechanics and postures and techniques. And I found it extremely difficult to go up to a random person and coach them on the best technique for the different lifts and that kind of stuff. So I kind of think of it in this way. So before asking management to go out and complete these observations or coaching kind of one-on-ones, you want to make sure that they're educated and knowledgeable and are able to do the job. So we're not kind of setting that middle management up for failure before we go ask them to do that. Another option is kind of safety talk. So some of the organizations that we've worked with, we've kind of co-developed some like MSI talking cards. They're really meant to just a little card to kind of grab, a manager would grab them before going out and doing a toolbox talk or a safety huddle. And it's just an easy way to continue the conversation around ergonomics and MSIs. And I'll touch on them a little bit more here in a second. Performance measures are another big one that I've heard a little bit more lately. And I think it makes sense. I mean, if we want people to focus on something and care about something, then we're not going to focus on anything more, care about anything more than the ways that our performance is evaluated. So if we include metrics in people's performance reviews, whether it's middle management, upper management, senior leadership, or even the frontline workers, they're going to focus on that and care about it a little bit more. I think the tricky thing is that as soon as you put something in someone's performance evaluation, you have to make sure that it's extremely measurable and the person who that's being measured on it knows how to achieve it. So they know how to measure it. They know what they're looking for. So some examples, like you could, going back to the management worker interactions, you could have like the manager needs to go out and do X number of engagements with workers per month. Or thinking about the safety cards, you could use a number that they need to achieve for their safety talks with their frontline workers. Or if we think back to the discomfort surveys, maybe a manager has to complete discomfort surveys with 80% of their staff on an annual basis. Something along the lines of that. Another one, I was on a kind of a virtual conference a couple weeks ago, and one of the speakers, she was an ergonomist with Ford, and they had engineers that were designing workstations and different kind of work systems, and they included kind of ergonomic performance measures in their engineers' performance review. And so what they did, they had a specific kind of ergonomic assessment tool that the engineers would use, and the engineers had to make sure that it didn't come out as like the highest risk level or the second highest risk level for the workstations that they were designing. And so it just made sure that the engineers were taking into account ergonomics and the worker when they were designing the workstations. So it was kind of that proactive way of making sure that when the workstations were rolled out, they didn't then go do an assessment and say, hey, this is a really high risk for a shoulder injury. So just a couple options, a little bit trickier because you have to make sure you're able to measure it, but definitely a sustainable approach if you can get it done, I think, on that performance side of things. This is an example of the MSI talking card. So again, just something quick a manager could grab off their desk. It's in the Q&A style with already curated questions and answers with some general MSI prevention topics, ergonomic hazards, just some easy stuff to go out and talk to your workforce about. And there's some follow-up questions kind of specific to your organization about how would you report an ergonomic hazard and things like that. So moving forward, I think some things that I think are cool coming up. So technology is definitely making ergonomic assessments a little bit more user-friendly and accessible. So WorkSafe BC has a digital lifting calculator, It's based on the revised NIOSH lifting equation. So you can go on their website and use that and kind of plug in the information about a task, and it'll calculate the acceptable weight limit of the object that they're lifting or moving. And again, kind of gives you a few variables that you or levers that you could kind of change to make the lifting task safer. And so that's a fun one to play around with for any lifting tasks that you have. Alberta has a assessment tool as well. It's in document form, but it's kind of based on the same information. And then NIOSH has a lifting calculator app as well. The last time I used it, it was still up and running. I'm not sure how long or if that will be impacted by any of the NIOSH stuff. And I think there's some other assessment tools coming out that are interesting and kind of tech any motion capture stuff. So I think understanding and being able to assess tasks for ergonomic hazards is going to be easier and more accessible, which I think is only a good thing. The other thing moving forward is I think we'll be trying to include more psychosocial metrics and indicators in our understanding of why MSIs are happening. There's quite a bit of overlap in the research in terms of if we think about why a sprain strain injury happens. There's a lot of overlap with not only the physical demands, which is typically what we think of if an injury or a sprain strain injury happens. We're typically thinking of the force, the postures, the repetitions. And there's starting to be some overlap in those psychosocial risk factors as well. And with psych safety and health being a kind of forefront thing currently, there's some work being done. This is just a snapshot of the APHI RM, which is a toolkit out of Australia. And I believe it stands for a participatory hazard identification and risk management toolkit. And it's survey-based, similar to the discomfort survey I showed you, but they include both physical risk factors as well as psychosocial risk factors. So it's kind of early on in this overlap between the physical and the psychosocial risk factors, but hopefully in the not too distant future, there will be some easy to use assessment tools so that we can get a little bit more kind of holistic view of the workplace. So that's the end for today. I appreciate everyone joining, and hopefully you were able to take something practical out of this that you can use in your own organization to prevent MSIs. If you do have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and I believe Paul will ask any if we have some.
Yeah, Sean, and I got several emails during your presentation from employers that there appears to be a tech issue. So not everyone who wanted to attend could attend. So I'm assuming the post this in a week. So this is going to be a recording, and maybe an employer would throw this on a Josh meeting or watch it themselves. But I'm trying to predict some questions that might have been asked. And one of the things, if a Josh committee was watching this and they saw that maybe they should include ergonomic hazards in their inspection forms where they didn't have it before, similar to the AWARE one where you're observing workers, or if they're included it in a incident investigation and they're going to go observe workers, would you recommend, because many organizations have different roles, that someone who has actually done the role observe and give their input versus, for instance, if it was a long-term care home, you wouldn't have necessarily someone from the kitchen observe a CCA. So I'm assuming that would be best case scenario, best practice.
Yeah, I mean, I always like someone being familiar with the role to give the inspection or to complete the inspection. I think there is some benefit in some rotation so that you do get some fresh eyes. I mean, the example is always like, well, you get used to your own workplace and you start to become numb to it, I guess, for a lack of a better term, and you might miss some hazards that fresh eyes might pick out. So I think there's some value in both. and sometimes organizations like team up on a workplace inspection. So two people would be going around to complete them. And if that's the case, you could have one person who's familiar with the work and one person who is like a fresh set of eyes. So that would be kind of getting and being able to come from both sides of that.
Great. The other question I was thinking is if you were going to add to, let's say, the inspection form, an ergonomic hazard, would you consult maybe your already existing safe work practices, or if you had a job site analysis from an OT, how would you kind of begin to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think starting with your own safe work practices. I mean, sometimes they're in a book and we kind of forget what they have on them. So I think starting there just to make sure you don't need to recreate the wheel. And then if you need to understand the hazard anymore, it would be looking at do we have any kind of internal assessments that we use, or do we need to go external to an OT or an ergonomist kind of outside to understand the task, and kind of go from there.
Okay, great. So what we'll do is when we post this, we'll include the links that were put in the chat.
Yep.
They'll be emailed out as well. If someone wanted assistance in this, you could email employer engagement at WCB. We'll give you the email. Engagement at wcb.ns.ca if you wanted some assistance, perhaps, with setting some of these things up that didn't exist in your safety program prior to this. Other than that, thank everybody and thanks Sean. Anything else, Sean?
Nope, I'm good. Appreciate it.